Good morning, everybody. I was interested to read an opinion piece by Professor Mary Daly in the business section of the Irish Times last week, commenting on the differences between the entrepreneurial culture of the Republic, say, compared to the United States. She drew attention to the history of Irish education. Entrepreneurship, she argued, is not as securely embedded in Irish culture as in others, because our university system was, and to a certain extent still is, modelled on 19th century ideologies. Historically, preparation for professional life was the purpose of a university education, especially in the fields of law, medicine, and the priesthood. These professions, argued Professor Daly, require groundings in particular modes of thinking and demand structured learning, a classical curriculum, and sometimes mastery of rather arcane forms of knowledge. Enterprise, on the other hand, came as second best to the nobler professions of the church, the court, and the operating theatre. The fact that business did not become part of the university curriculum until the mid-20th century attests to the dominance of this culture. And as Daly notes, the rule-breaking innovation and flexibility which fosters entrepreneurial thinking is largely absent from formal schooling. And just as an aside, I'd like to say I don't think that entrepreneurship is merely about industry. Any freelance actor, artist, designer, filmmaker that I know is a self-starter and entrepreneur. Reading Professor Daly, I was brought back to the educational writings of Patrick Pearse. I often think of Pearse at this time of the year, as the slow build-up towards the publication of the Leaving Cert results is under construction. And every year, I think of how much he would have hated the ideology of state education, which is paraded before us as true achievement. 600 points, 10 A1s, well done. The industry around educational achievement is well oiled. Newspaper supplements showcasing exam tips and profiles of boffins who've scored exceptionally high points. The publication of exam papers and test answers, digestive notes, grind schools, and tutorial systems is one of our thriving Indigenous industries. So why do I think of Pearse? Well, for me, Pearse's greatest value lies in his writings on education and his vision of how an education system should underpin any national project. Pearse was first and foremost an educator, and I think all of his political thinking may be traced back to his ideas on education. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that his political philosophies are meaningless without understanding his educational philosophies. Over 100 years ago, Pearse wrote a damning assessment of the Irish education system in a pamphlet you might be familiar with called The Murder Machine. In it, he likened schooling to a vast industrial apparatus, which takes children in one end and squeezes out all their quirks, creativity, and natural curiosity. And, in an efficient conveyor belt system, turns out numerate and literate creatures fit for the professions. Or, with the less perfectly formed, and these are Pearse's words, not mine, for the civil service. Instead of inspiring children, the education system was taming them. It contributed to their ineptitude and highlighted their powerlessness by alienating them from what they knew and what they understood. He wrote, "Education has not to do with the manufacture of things, but with fostering the growth of things." 600 points, 10 A1s. The echo reverberates back and forwards in time, going nowhere. I'd like today to put forward some thoughts on the relationship between Pearse, as one of the founders of our nation state, his ideas on education and citizenship, and to think about what teaching allegiance to the state might mean within a national education system. The proclamation's claim for equal rights and opportunities for the Republic citizens, the children of the nation, which includes all of us, it's not just age-specific, is of course rooted in the Republican thinking of the 18th century. References to Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet appear all through Pearse's work. He admired them hugely. Indeed, the iconic side profiles of Pearse that we're familiar with owe as much to him modelling himself in Emmet's image as it does to disguising the fact that he had a lazy eye. Pearse gave a commemorative address at the grave of Wolfe Tone in Bodenstown in 1913 and 2 orations on Emmet in 1914, both in New York. These speeches were designed to be heard and not to be read, so their impact for us is somewhat lessened in print. Yet contemporary accounts confirm that Pearse was a superb orator and public speaker. He was passionate and lyrical, determined and convincing. However, if you were to try and construct a political philosophy from these speeches, you'd be hard-pressed. Pearse was inspired by them as men, rather than as political thinkers per se, although he upheld and advocated their principles of egalitarianism. He was particularly drawn to Wolfe Tone, and from 1910 onwards, he read and reread Tone's autobiography. Tone appeared to Pearse as a kindred spirit. Like Pearse, he had studied law, and disenchanted to discover that law is not necessarily about justice, they had both abandoned it. Tone, like Pearse, was a true egalitarian and democrat. Both were ambitious, single-minded, and idealistic. But most of all, Tone was a man of action. He had attempted to realise his beliefs despite the likely negative outcome. And this was immensely appealing to Pearse. And as Ruth Dudley Edwards has noted, this craving for action began to dominate Pearse's thinking, and combined with his literary and oratorical gifts, it made him an object of interest to revolutionary groups. It was after the Bodenstown Address that Thomas Clarke, who had been sceptical about Pearse's brand of nationalism, sat up and took notice. "I never thought there was much stuff in Pearse," he said. And from that point on, Pearse was marked out as of interest and possible use to the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Between 1910 and 1912, Pearse was becoming increasingly radical in his thinking, although he didn't join the IRB until 1913. For much of the previous period, he had been a loose supporter of the ideas of Home Rule, hence Thomas Clarke's reservations about his brand of nationalism. But his politics and energy had, from 1908, been put into founding and running his own school, St Enda's in Rathfarnham. Therefore, it's not difficult to see why he admired men like Tone and Emmett, who had the courage of their convictions. And for all the poetic dreaming, and somehow the legacy of Pearse is that he was a dreamy idealist, Pearse was an intensely practical man. He was running a boarding and day school and dealing with the everyday details of laundry, meals, textbooks, bills, as well as the arduous practice of daily teaching. If we're looking for political influences from the 18th century, we must return to education, which is at the root of all of Pearse's radical thinking. Pearse first proposes the idea of a citizen republic during his time as the editor of the Gaelic League newspaper on Clive Sullish in 1905. However, he's not talking about political revolution. Remember, at this stage, his national politics is still quite conservative, but instead is advocating a new model of education. We are perhaps familiar by now with how popular nationalism was influenced by the emergence of literary and cultural forms, ballads, sports, stories, leading to the establishment of a network of institutions such as the Gaelic League, the Abbey Theatre, the GAA, and so on. However, the Indian post-colonial theorist Partha Chatterjee identifies education as a central reform through which cultural expression can be explored and developed. The emergent forms of cultural nationalism in literature, language, music, art, and drama come together and are most powerfully articulated and consolidated in a school environment. There is no other place where all of these elements come together so easily. Pearse understood this, that our schools are critical to the fostering of citizenship. This is directly linked to the philosophy of the Enlightenment and ideas about childhood, personal liberation and social formation espoused by thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And later, 19th century educationists like Maria Montessori laid the groundwork for embedding concepts of individual achievement within early childhood education. So, for me, it is the seeds of Enlightenment ideas on individual liberty and learning which are most influential in Pearse's vision for a republic, and that later places him within a continuum of nationalist longing beside Tone and Emmett, as well as John Mitchell, Thomas Davis, and Fintan Lawler. So what is this child republic that Pearse attempts to build? The radically progressive nature of Pearse's vision was focused on a system where the child as child was paramount, not child as exam result or prototype civil servant. He saw education as an agent of social change. He envisaged school as a civic space and encouraged a view of childhood as significant in itself and not merely a life stage in the development of the adult. And for us in 2013, this may seem self-evident, even tired. But in Pearse's time, when schooling was a blunt instrument cruelly administered, it was quite revolutionary. Between 1908, when Pearse first opened the doors to his school, until 1913, when he joined the IRB, his politics was fueled by pedagogy rather than rebellion. Even after 1913, when he became radicalised, his political writings and speeches tend towards the rhetorical. He advocates freedoms for the individual and evokes ideas of national spirituality and feeling, of yearning and striving, of reclaiming rather vague ideas of shared Irishness through physical action. It's not really what we would call a political roadmap. There's no sense of what the nuts and bolts of nation building would look like post-revolution. And so perhaps we can get a better sense of Pearse's vision for the new republic in St. Enda's, which operated as a sort of microcosm of what he thought a nation-state could be. Part of Pearse's approach was to take existing imperial models of education and recast them as ancient Irish forms. And to that extent, he advocates old Irish practices of fosterage, where boys are sent to study with masters. And although Pearse's education experiments were largely to do with boys, he was very keen on the education of girls, so I really wouldn't distinguish between boys and girls here. The idea of the boy being sent to the master, which is evident in the monastic Christian system and also in the kind of older bardic societies, such as the Fianna Éireann and the Druidic system. He writes extensively on the immersive benefits of schooling, where a child's education is not only centred in the classroom, but in playing fields, in museums, in gardens, in drama clubs, in debating societies, in science labs, where every aspect of their lives teaches them about their native culture and heritage. Conveniently bypassing the existence of such schooling models already existent in Britain, he instead advocates St. Enda's as the modern-day equivalent of the natural culture of the ancient Irish. Yet there is no doubt that Pearse's model was infinitely more humane and nurturing than the English public school model. First and foremost, he considered that the school should, where possible, emulate home life, rather than the military model advocated by the more brutish boarding schools in Ireland and England. There's no corporal punishment. Willie Pearse had been badly bullied at school, and Pearse was vehemently anti-corporal punishment. Interestingly, there were no priests in charge, and although it was a Catholic school, it was run by lay people, thereby belying the perception that Pearse was slavishly devoted to the Catholic Church. He was also keenly aware of the demographic profile of his fee-paying students, and he understood the needs and aspirations of an emerging nationalist middle class. His central philosophy focused on the question, how is a citizen made? Pupils were involved in most aspects of the school's governance, consulted as to curricular change, internal organisation and work schedules. The pupils were invited to select their own leaders at the beginning of each school year. Desmond Ryan, a past pupil, recalls that they were allowed to shape the internal government of the school, and annual elections were a significant and exciting point in the school calendar, operating as, quote, an Ireland in miniature. The curriculum itself was enlightened even by today's standards. Boys were offered classes in French, German, Italian, Spanish, music and dancing lessons, the natural sciences, botany, zoology, geology, as well as practical lessons in shorthand, bookkeeping and typewriting. Gaelic football, hurling and handball were installed as the school games, and among some of the visiting lectures were on French literature, art, classics, horticulture, phonetics, philosophy, Egyptology, physics, and medieval history, and that was only in the first year. Visitors included prominent public figures, W.B. Yeats, Douglas Hyde, the Markoviches, Roger Casement, and many, many other luminaries of the nationalist movement connecting into the children. The boys were a regular fixture in Dublin's social and cultural life between 1908 and 1916, and were often referred to as emblematic as the potential of the Irish state. They performed plays and pageants from Irish history on the school grounds and in Jones's Road, which is now, of course, Croke Park. They drilled in military formation through the streets, but they also staged plays in the formality of the Abbey Theatre, and images of them playing Gaelic games, gardening and bathing in the school grounds were sold as postcards to raise funds for the school. By teaching the boys how to be national citizens, ultimately the cultural project of St. Enda's, Pearse was trying to fashion a generation of boys to articulate a new social and cultural order, namely our idea of the Republic. However, history has taught us that inculcating political allegiances to young men dressed in military uniforms is not such a great idea. So how to get the balance right between teaching the value of public service and producing proto-fascist youth movements? Certainly on leaving St Enda's, pupils embarked on years of extraordinary social and political upheaval, yet the ethos of public service they learned at school was indeed realised in their later service to the state as architects, teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, writers, journalists, soldiers. No priests, as far as I can ascertain. Was it Pearse's carefully designed curriculum that prepared them for the challenge of running the new state? Padraig Yeats's History of Dublin between 14 and 18 illustrates how the First World War changed Irish history much more significantly than the 1916 Rising. Most of us have been taught about the Rising as if it were an event in isolation, but Yeats's book contextualises 1916 within social concerns of the day: rising fuel costs and food shortages, labour disputes, and particularly the losses of Irish soldiers, especially the growing bitterness caused by criticism of Irishmen at Gallipoli in 1915, which had a very bitter legacy, housing crises, and the diversion of resources towards the war effort. These factors and more created a climate in which national determination gained ground. As early as 1914, Pearse recognised that the confluence of events leading to the war has brought about a crisis which may contain, as yet hidden within it, the moment for which the generations have been waiting. It was not the glorious sacrifice of the rebels which secured our future, but a complex merging of social, cultural, and political agendas which determined the direction of events, not design, but accident. And so it is no surprise that the fragile network of allegiances fragmented after the Civil War and in the early years of the state. It would have been impossible for everybody's dreams to have been realised. The Civil War left its mark on the politics of the St Enda's boys as it did elsewhere. The school did not prosper. It limped on, burdened by debt, and to everybody's relief, it closed in 1935. While we might argue that it was the confluence of events, the perfect storm of rebellion, which led to the founding of the Republic, it is easier to consider how Pearse's legacy after his death was moulded, shaped and designed to meet the ideological needs of the new state. The real damage was to Pearse's educational philosophy. He was included in the new curriculum, but only his short stories, useful for their simple and uncomplicated Irish. His Memoirs of St Enda became part of the exams for the County Council, and his early writings on literature, written when he was only 19, became mandatory reading in teacher training colleges. Pearse's naive stories about the spiritual beauty of the west of Ireland and the reification of children became part of the new educational orthodoxy because they sat very easily within a Catholic ethos. His more innovative ideas about educating the whole child were not so much set aside as completely abandoned. Back in 14, Pearse had countered that the work of the first Minister of Education in a free Ireland will be a work of creation, for out of chaos he will have to evolve order, and into a dead mass he will have to breathe the breath of life. Instead, struggling with overcrowded classrooms, financial austerity, badly resourced schools, sounding familiar, and the ideological demand to Gaelicise Irish education, Pearse's complex and liberal ideas became reduced to a narrowly focused religious and nationalist orthodoxy, which was to define his public perception for years. Not accident, but design. Pearse's unrealised educational philosophy continues to throw a long shadow over Irish educational reform in the Republic. Perhaps it was all too vague. Perhaps it needed the naive belief, drive and doggedness of Pearse as the first Minister for Education. Perhaps his pedagogical vision of citizenship could never have been scaled up and rolled out across the new state. But in any case, it was so watered down as to become incomprehensible. In conclusion, where stands our education system today? There are moments of brightness. The energy and vitality of the annual Young Scientist exhibition is particularly heartening. Here is curiosity and entrepreneurial thinking and citizenship at its best. And there is progress as we move towards 2016. Slowly and steadily, the calcified apparatus of the junior and leaving cert and the grip of religious orthodoxy is being loosened under the determined hand of our current Minister for Education, Ruairi Quinn. And perhaps the time is coming when we cease to measure the merit of our younger citizens in points or in grades. And if that happens, I will be thinking of Pearse on that day too.